Thank you for joining our last lecture and panel for our second day of the conference. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Kateryna Botanova. She's a Basel-based cultural critic, curator, and writer from Kyiv, Ukraine. She writes and lectures on decoloniality, solidarity, and care with a special focus on artistic practices and societal dynamics outside of the global West. She's a co-curator of the Swiss multidisciplinary Biennale Culture Spaces and an editor of its anthologies. Since 2023, she has been a guest curator of the research platform of the Pinchuk Art Center in Kyiv. In 2010, she was a director of the Center for Contemporary Art in Kyiv and a founding editor of the online magazine Corridor. She's a member of PEN Ukraine. Her essays on decoloniality, solidarity, and artistic practices in Ukraine during the war have and will appear in Eurozine, Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Dvutegodnik, and various artists, among other media, and in books, some peer-reviewed. Ukraine's many faces, and in books. Ukraine's many faces, land, people, and culture, and objectives of the Russo-Ukraine War in Forum Transregionale Studien, Terra Invicta, Ukrainian wartime reimaginings for habitable Earth, Art in Ukraine between identity construction and anti-colonial resistance, Decolonization of memory in the former Soviet spaces. In 2023, she gave lectures and keynotes at the University of Basel, Södertörn Universities in Stockholm, Forum on Central and Eastern Europe, KU Leuven, Pilecki-Institut Berlin, and Hamburg University. So, thank you, Kateryna. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone who stayed till this late afternoon, and we start a panel where I will appear in two roles. First, as a lecturer, and then as a moderator, because the overall framework of this last panel for tonight is the decoloniality in Ukrainian discourse, and how in practical terms, as you saw before in the title, so how in approaches to museum, education, public spaces, and art in general, what does it mean to exercise a decolonial approach, and how is it being understood in different focuses? I will present you a research which was done by standards of a time which is flying really fast now, which was done last year in the framework of the research platform of Pinchuk Art Center. Those of you who were in the workshop 3 today, you've heard a discussion about the temporalities in contemporary Ukrainian art, which a colleague of mine, Shlipchenko, presented, which was also done within the research platform. This research, well, definitely because we have very little time, I will basically show you just the snippets because it's a bigger work. And also, obviously, it's a work that doesn't grow only from my research. It grows out of quite an extensive body of a research on the Russian avant-garde, or so-called Russian avant-garde, which has been developed since late 80s. But obviously, after the beginning of full-scale invasion, the question of how art from Ukraine and Ukrainian art, which is not always the same thing, how it has been and how it is being presented in different Western artistic institutions. So although Lucas told that, my focus is on the artistic practices outside of global West, this is actually rather an exception. And the reason why, with all the research which was and is being done on this, why I came to this in 2023, also because this notion of decoloniality, which we're discussing and will be discussing, during these 3 days, not in a literal sense of looking at Ukraine as a colony or potential colony of Russian Empire, Soviet Union, which again is a separate subject, we can talk about it, but decoloniality as an epistemological tool, as a tool which allows us to see how the knowledge is being built and produced, which means who is talking for whom, from which position, and what kind of knowledge and awareness it creates in the audiences who are on the perception side, of this narrative. So what we will see today is not even so much about the exhibitions per se. I take 4 exhibitions in this case, but more about the narrative which was built around it. And the question of so-called Russian avant-garde is interesting as a case study here, in particular because it became such a brand name, which sells well in a very literal sense. I mean, the works that are still available, although it's believed to be the most, the market with the most fakes nowadays, but also as something which, sells you the exhibition. So if you see the exhibition of Russian avant-garde, most likely you will have quite a lot of audiences. Another important point for me in this discussion about the Russian avant-garde and exhibitions in Northern America and Western Europe is the notion which was developed by the Polish art historian Piotr Petrovsky in the early 2000s, notion of a horizontal history of European avant-garde. Petrovsky's point was that when it comes to a discussion of the avant-garde in general, there is a Western avant-garde, and then there is a Russian, which stays separately and is being kind of taken and looked at as the only possible interlocutor. And we will see now, hopefully in this presentation, that maybe even a predecessor of Western European avant-gardes, but nothing in between, which is Central and Eastern European avant-gardes, even exist. The point that Petrovsky was making is to try and see and write a different history of very potent and very powerful avant-garde movements which were happening in Poland, in Hungary, in Czech Republic. But even in his discussion and the discussion that was built around Petrovsky's point, this discussion did not transcend the border of the former Soviet Union. So you can talk about the Polish avant-garde, but Ukrainian avant-garde, for example, never kind of appeared in that discussion. With those things in a focus, what I did in the research, I looked at the centenary, at 100 years of October Revolution, which definitely, maybe you even remember it, was a case of a huge celebration in the world. And overall, there were several dozens of different kind of exhibitions, plus conferences, plus discussion platforms, plus whatever you want, all over Western Europe and Northern America. I took 4, and today we will be talking about the exhibition Revolutionary Impulse, the Rise of the Russian Avant-Garde in MoMA in New York, 2016-17. Red Star over Russia, London, Tate Modern in 1718. The Revolution is Dead, Long Live the Revolution in 2 institutions, in Kunstmuseum Bern, in Zentrum Paul Klee Bern in Switzerland in 2017. And finally in 2019, Rouge, Red, Art and Utopia in the Land of Soviets in Grand Palais and Centre Pompidou in Paris. And very shortly, my main research questions were, what's the relation in those exhibitions between avant-garde as an artistic practice and the political context where it's happening? Who tells the story? So who owns the gaze and from which position is being seen what we're shown in the exhibitions? When we're talking about the artists presented in the exhibitions, do we see the context? Do we understand where do these artists come from? What inspired them? How are they connected between themselves and also with a wider context? And last, but definitely not the least, what does it tell us when we see those exhibitions between 2016 and 19, which means well after the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of war in Donbass? Do we see the presence of Russia? And how and why? That's a lot, but I will try to fit in time. So we start in MoMA, we start in New York. The interesting, please remember that I'll be jumping, but if there are questions, then we can try and address them afterwards. The interesting thing about this particular exhibition is that it's very important that it's built around the first director and basically the founder of MoMA, Alfred Barr, who spent the winter of 1928-29 in Moscow. This experience of being there at that time basically brought him the vision and the understanding of what kind of museum he wants to build. So his vision of MoMA, which is one of the biggest, the most important museums of modern and contemporary art in the world, sort of stems from that experience of his. And also this is the exhibition which is mostly built on an own collection because MoMA has the most extensive collection of the Russian avant-garde outside Russia up to date. So this brings the exhibition a sort of a personal touch and personal feeling. And as we read in the curatorial statement, and I quote, that the avant-garde, the Russian avant-garde, is attributed with the remarkable sense of creative urgency, the radical cross-fertilization and synthesis within the visual arts, and the aspiration among the Russian avant-garde to effect unprecedented socio-political transformation. Please pay attention to the superlatives, to the way how the discussion about the avant-garde is being built. And also, we will see it in all the exhibitions, but I will stress it here. When the curators build the exhibition, and throughout the whole exhibition, throughout all the educational, PR, and every material, exclusively use the term Russian revolution, and Russian avant-garde, how does it actually refer to the reality of very multi-ethnic Russian Empire and the Soviet Union? Do we see through all these artists branded Russian, do we see the various origins? Do we see the educational backgrounds? Do we see how did they come to the work they were doing? And also specifically in this exhibition, and I love this quote very much because the curators believe that the artists in this exhibition have, or the works in this exhibition, have a distinctly Russian character, drawing on history, folklore, and religious motives. We can talk a lot about the different artists that are attributed to Russian avant-garde and where they came from and what motives they were drawn to, but the very simple and widely discussed example, and I think one of our co-panelists later will also refer to that, we have Kazimir Malevich, who is a Polish-born, Ukrainian educated, very much involved in the Kyiv artistic milieu artist, and also the artist who came back to Kyiv closer to the end of his life and his career at the end of 20s, because basically it was the only place where he could actually work. In Moscow, in Leningrad, by the time the working was not possible. Alexandra Ekster, who also basically built her visual language out of her extensive work in Kyiv with the Pilecki-Institut, with the Kyiv milieu, and with embroidery workshops that were created in central Ukraine of that time, and also the wonderful case of Dziga Vertov, who did his most famous films also in 1920s, late 1920s in Ukraine, including Man with a Movie Camera, which was featured in this exhibition, but the curators decided that he was Russia's Buster Keaton. This exhibition had an ambition, and also we will see that ambition throughout the other exhibitions that I want to talk about, but basically in most of other exhibitions around the revolution and the avant-garde, the exhibition to show how these artists were attempting to change the society. So this connection between the avant-garde artistic impulse and basically socio-political impulse to rebuild the society. We hear it, we can read it in the text, but then we can also read it in the review of the leading art critic from the New York Times, Roberta Smith, that suggested that it was a giant step for art, but also a giant step for probably humankind. But then we come to the exhibition itself, and we see that the giant step for humankind is built exclusively on the works and on the position and on the collection and on the narratives seen and written and narrated through the two cities, which is Moscow and St. Petersburg, Petrograd, Leningrad. Geographically and culturally, nothing else on any level is presented in this exhibition. And also, if we go through the halls, and we don't have time for that now, but you see the clear and sterile environment of the museum. So this whole political story of, the changing the society, whatever it means, and we know it can mean many things in this particular case, is not present at all. The artworks do not have a political background here. So they're supposed to tell you the story about the huge change, but this change is nowhere to be seen. If you look at this exhibition on the surface, there is no Russian money involved. Again, we remember this is 2016. The war is already there, and the sanctions are a bit there. But there is an extensive public program to this exhibition. There are discussions, there are colloquium, and the scholar panel, for example, was funded and organized with the support of Vrino Group, which is a Russian conglomerate owned by Russian billionaire Viktor Vekselberg, who went under explicit sanctions in 2022. And we move to London. This is Tate Modern. This is exhibition Red Star over Russia, a revolution in visual culture, 1905-1955. Already from the first image, which greets you when you enter the space, you see the domination of the color, and you see the domination of the world, the word Russia, which greets you. This exhibition is also collection-based. This is based on the collection of the late British artist and designer David King, who was in love with Russia, who traveled extensively, again, to Moscow and to Leningrad. And he didn't collect artworks per se, but he collected ephemera and memorabilia. So photographs, posters, paintings, books. He was interested into the practical side of the avant-garde, so how the artists were created something for a wider use of education or propaganda, for masses of people. The curators do say in their statement that they're interested in seismic political events that led to social transformation, that inspired a wave of innovation in art and graphic design across the country. But again, if you look through the exhibition materials, you will not see anything except for Russia and Russian. The interesting thing, two actually interesting things about this exhibition, is that the curators state that they want to look into how the artists, the avant-garde artists, were trying to educate and entertain the new society, and also how images were manipulated during a period of widespread state censorship, because you see the time frame goes to well into not just the censorship but even to death of Stalin and beyond. But we have an exhibition in 2017 and 18 where the curators state an attempt to show how in, let's imagine, 20s and 30s and maybe 40s, the images were manipulated and how this censorship came up. And in an interview with BBC, one of the curators, Matthew Gale, said that the exhibition was, quote, inviting comparison with what's going on around the world right now. But if you walk around the exhibition, with one exception of the bookshop, you don't see any information of Russian propaganda or misinformation or manipulation. And in the bookshop, among a few books about the Russian propaganda, of course, there was a wonderful book by Britain-based Ukrainian researcher Peter Pomeranzem, who I hope you know. Another wonderful thing which we will, wonderful, I'm trying to be cynical here, which we'll find in other exhibitions as well, but here it's quite articulated, is that the exhibition talks and shows, or at least hints at the reality of the Great Terror, which was happening next to the visual revolution, but this is still so glorified and described with a lot of fascination. In this quote, which I suggest, from the interview to the BBC of one of the curators, it's, I think, quite peculiar how the tyrants are being made idealists, and this sort of supposed to balance each other, and also against the rights of women, which is a trope which I found quite repeated in a lot of Western discussions about what happened in the Soviet Union in end of 20s and 30s, when the rights of women were kind of juxtaposed to the huge repression and great terror, as if they somehow, I don't know, balance each other. And last, also curious point, I promise you I'll be jumping, well, almost last, is that, of course, this very famous photograph by Evgeny Khaldei, which was a part of exhibition, went over various media in Britain, because, how can you pass it? Everybody knows that you have to use it. But here in this review in The Guardian, it's quite amazing that the writer looks at the references to the abstract art, and she sees Malevich and then Lisitsky, maybe a little bit of Tatlin if she doesn't say it. But what she doesn't see, what she doesn't write about, which I think is the core of this photograph, is that Khaldei is a Ukrainian Jew. He comes from Yuzivka, which is Donetsk now. His almost whole family was killed, exterminated by this moment. And this red flag, which is being put there on the rooftop, is a red flag which was sewn and given to him by his uncle, one of the few survivors. And by this, it traveled with a photographer to Berlin, which I think make the whole story of the connection of the land, of the personal story behind the image, a bit more than just the references to the shapes and forms of the Russian avant-garde. This exhibition was happening at the same time as the big retrospective by Ilya and Emilia Kabakov, the Dnipropetrovsk-born artist, and the joint public program for both exhibitions was funded by VAC Foundation, very well-known foundation in Russia, funded by Leonid Mikhelson, one of the Russian gas toucans, and his other hand, let's say his other branch, his gas company Novatek was funding specifically exhibition of Kabakov, and also Roman Abramovich, whom you might have heard, he was one of the biggest Russian aficionados of the contemporary art, also funded the exhibition of Kabakov. In Bern, this exhibition had two sides, and this is the two covers of a catalog. They wisely created one book with a flip cover, spread between the two institutions, two museums, Kunstmuseum Bern and Centrum Paul Klee. And the story in Bern obviously sort of started, it took as a starting point the Ornithologist Congress, or the first Socialist Congress, which happened in 1915 in Bern, where Lenin and Trotsky were present in particular. This exhibition is probably the most ambitious. It takes the longest period of time. It starts from the early pre-revolutionary works and goes all the way into the late 90s with two ambitions. First is to show how so-called Russian avant-garde influenced the avant-garde movements around the world. So they show a lot of works from Western and non-Western contexts, but also show how it was succeeded and whether it was succeeded in the later times and later movements. So they go to Soc art, and then they go to the early post-Soviet art. The curious thing about this exhibition was that none of the curators, and there were like two main curators, one for the first part and one for the second part, and the teams around them, none were a specialist on Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, or even Russia. This is a bit about how the gaze was built. Which led to the fact, let's go here for a moment, that the catalog, so the introductions to the chapters of the exhibition, but also the introductions to particular artists, were written by researchers and writers from Russia or with a Russian origin. Boris Groys, Margarita and Viktor Tupitsyn, and Ekaterina Dyogat. Moreover, in the curatorial text, you would see a lot of references to these same people. None of the other art historians or none of the other, not just Ukrainian, any specialists were present whatsoever. If you go deeper in those introductions and how the different time periods and how different artists are being talked about, you will also notice that this story is told exclusively from the position of Moscow or St. Petersburg, Leningrad. So even the artist, as Boris Mikhailov, about whom I will talk in a second, who spent a few years there, still the whole story about him is told as if that was the most pivotal part of his career and his life. Another peculiar, I'm sorry to say, thing which comes out of this very Russocentric perspective is that you can see in the wall texts in the museum, but also in the catalog, the mentions of the Great Famine or Great Terror, because we're talking about, again, about how the art influenced the society when it happened, but there are no specifications. So this Great Famine, for example, it doesn't have a name, and you have no idea where it happened. Just probably happened somewhere. The case of Boris Mikhailov, and why I want to talk about, it's a bit too early, about him, they took his most famous, probably, and most controversial series of photography called Case History. And the thing about Mikhailov is he's one of the biggest names in Ukrainian contemporary art. He's the founder of, or one of co-founders of Kharkiv School of Photography. And he's a person who chose to stay in Kharkiv, and in the mid-90s to the early 2000s was working in particular on this. It's a huge collection, actually. The Case History has, I think, a couple hundred even visuals on the life of the dispossessed, of the people who, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, went to the street and basically disappeared from the social framework. But somehow, writing about him, Margarita Tupitsyn completely oversees this intention. And the only thing we learn from her introduction, she's an American-based researcher, is that his whole world fell apart, and that's why he was so disheveled and lost, that he was making photos of something which she also called Soviet Ukraine and Soviet streets. So this is 90s and early 2000s, Soviet Ukraine and Soviet streets. These two exhibitions did not have an obvious Russian money, but they were extensively built on loans from different Russian museums. And I think it's just a nice peculiarity. You've seen this as a part of a cover of a catalog. This is a work called What the Homeland Begins With by the Russian pop artist duo, Vinogradov and Dubosarsky, with a fantastic big Russian flag. And the last, I'll try to be very fast, it's an exhibition in Paris, prepared by Centre Pompidou, and here it's completely based on loans from Russian museums, and the whole point of the exhibition was to show to the French public something which they haven't seen before. The curator of the exhibition had two fascinations. First, that he tried to see and show also to the French society sort of the reality of the fatherland of socialism, as he put it in his text. But his other fascination was what he called the Michelangelesque figures of workers and frames. So the exhibition visually was built on two main motifs. One was different depictions of Stalin and Lenin with a different sort of situation, which, by the way, is something which was absent from the previous exhibitions. There was not so much there. But in case of this exhibition, Stalin and Lenin were everywhere. And also this superly corporeal bodies of Soviet farmers and workers, in which also, it's a quote, the curator found a very particular eroticism. But what also I found very specific about this exhibition is that in promotion and marketing materials, there was a promotional video, a two-minute video, which was built on the compilation of this romantic and big figures from Alexander Deneka, from Petrov Vodkin, but merged also with the portraits of Stalin, children, Lenin. But the interesting thing is that the footage of this video was overlaid by the song of the Soviet poet Vsevolod Rozhdestinsky, which was performed by Alexandrov Red Army Choir. Those you who know a bit of the Soviet context, you can imagine how it sounds. And the song which they were performing in 2019 was about the beauty of travel through the motherland, which takes the protagonists through the steppes of Kuban and the Black Sea and the severe Caucasus and the rocky Crimea. I wouldn't suggest the conclusions, but a few points instead of conclusions, just running very quickly over the exhibitions. What I see quite peculiar that the different artists and different institutions and different creators spread in the, all over the Western world managed to look at the notion and the phenomenon of avant-garde, but still try to see beyond it and to see into this tragic mystery of the revolution and whatever happened on one hand, but on the other hand, they imagined to kind of extract the artists from their environment because the political context, the social context, not just the tragic one, of the terror, but also the very sheer engagement of artists, especially in early pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary years into the changing of society, is not seen or read whatsoever. In the interviews, in the PR materials, in the publication, in the catalogs, you run into a lot of superlatives. So the phenomenon of a Russian Revolution and avant-garde is being talked with a lot of adjectives and a lot of fascination. Although the phenomenon of avant-garde, and for most exhibitions that go beyond it because they go into 50s and sometimes into 80s and 90s, it's geographically a very wide phenomena. But in all those exhibitions, we see the metropole-centered gaze. Everything is being seen and shown and written from the position of the two major Russian metropole cities. And the last but not the least, what happens when the audiences in the 2016 and 19, again, way after the beginning of the war in Donbass, see the story about the great Russian Revolution? What happens when they see the works of a great Russian avant-garde artist? What happens when there is no complexity to that context, when there are no understanding where these people come from and what formed them or what took their lives, because a lot of those artists exhibit in those exhibitions, they perished at the end of 1920s and in 1930s. What happens when there is a war on one hand, but there is a great so-called Russian culture, fantastically celebrated with the big words of Russia or Russian over the facades of the main artistic institutions over the world? We should probably ask ourselves how these narratives of global importance of Russian avant-garde and its role in revolutionizing the art world, but the world in general, how it plays very well into the playbook of the Russian propaganda today. Thank you. We will be moving to a discussion of the decolonial discourse from the other side, not from the Western European and Northern American, but from Ukrainian side. I just wanted to ask if you have questions specifically to the context of my presentation. We can take a few now, or we can save, if they're wider, to the context of decolonization in general, then we can save to a Q&A after the panel. So tell me.
Well, I know there was a huge exhibition of Ukrainian avant-garde. Hello? Sorry. Thank you. I know there was a pretty huge exhibition of Ukrainian avant-garde after the full-scale full-scale invasion, and it traveled from country to country. How do you think, could it somehow change the situation from there? If I'm not mistaken, there was a collection of Ukrainian avant-garde from several museums. For example, Ukrainian
Yes, it's an exhibition called In the Eye of a Storm, and yeah, it traveled 5 countries, I think, now. And it's quite an impressive amount of work, especially taking into account that the first exhibition in Madrid opened in, I think, November 22, so in the midst of basically the beginning of full scale. I hope it changes the discussion and brings more context to, the names and the works introduced. It's just that one exhibition, even if it's shown in important art institutions, is not enough. Okay, 2 more questions. Okay, 3 more questions. Maybe I collect them, and then we move to the panel.
Yes, it's more a comment, and don't get me wrong, I'm not contradicting anything of your conclusions, but I think you should add one element, and that's that the exhibition makers had a holiday because Russia was walking on eggshells itself, celebrating the revolution, right? So they could celebrate the revolution as something which is not definitely Putin's agenda, and I think that gives it a bit more of an explanation why they would kind of say they're doing something which is more subversive than it was. Right?
Well, I totally see your point, and I also understand when the big money comes handy, why not use it? But on the other hand, maybe, overall, the question of money in the art world, it's a big question, but maybe particularly in this case, when on one hand, there is a war which is condemned by, we say, a global community, and there are sanctions and everything, but the money still works because culture is beyond the war. We should start asking ourselves questions, not only about that money, but in general, which kind of money work, where, and is it okay? There were 2 more questions.
Thank you so much for the amazing talk. I have 2 questions. The first one is very general. I have an impression that nowadays avant-garde has become customized by, safe bourgeois taste of, middle class, something that is not evoking as many emotions as it used to be. It's domesticized by the middle class, by academia, and so on. And the Russian or Soviet case is to be seen within this tendency. I can remember then when I was in St. Petersburg 15 years ago, and the reproductions of avant-garde art were available mostly in the souvenir shops. Were something that could be buy between this kitchen matryoshka and I don't know some other stuff, and it was clear that it's something to attract the tourists from the West who just want something finer, but nonetheless something that would be safe and wouldn't destroy their worldview at all. And the second question is very short. Does it review of the London exhibition mention that this famous picture of soldiers on the Reichstag was photoshopped? That one of the soldiers was wearing 2 watches, and of course that was unacceptable from the point of view of propaganda. Was it mentioned, or was it not considered not to be mentioned at all? Thank you very much.
I think there was one more question, and then I'll shortly answer, and then we move to a panel.
I have a question. Recently in Paris, I was looking for a book from Vita Suzak about Ukrainian artists in Paris, beginning of the 20th century, with many of whom actually came in the course of the events of the Russian Revolution. And I finally found this book in the shelf of Eastern European and Russian art in the Centre Pompidou library. And it was the only book about Ukraine, or somehow connected to the topic of Ukraine, in a collection of a couple of 100 books, with almost all of them entitled with either USSR or Russia. So that seems to me that while Russian arts actually is able to gain recognition precisely through the distance and through this abstract sort of fascination in the West, Ukrainian artists can only gain recognition if they are actually traveling or migrating, engaging with a local context in the West. And it seems to me that now it's a bit similar in terms of it's not just the urgency of the situation that makes Ukrainian arts visible, but also the fact that actually many artists migrated and are actually very hardworking in order to make their works seen. So first of all, do you agree with this pattern? And second, what to do to break those dynamics?
The catalog of this In the Eye of a Storm exhibition is also sold on Amazon under the section of, I think, Russian or Eastern European and Russian books, something like that. So it's not only in Paris. Maybe as short as I can in the order of the questions about Haldei's picture. I don't remember that, unfortunately, whether there was a comment on the Photoshop there. It's been quite some time of this exhibition. But overall, why the case of avant-garde is so interesting, and I think it will attract a new circle of attention from the professional, at least I hope so now, is because it's so easily commodified. It's so easily pacified with this image of, incredible changes in the society, although first you have to really look into the society and put more political context behind. And also we have to understand that the works of artists and the political beliefs of artists and the fates of artists, which are called, let's say, Russian Empire and the Soviet avant-garde, changed dramatically from 1910s into end of 20s, 30s for those who survived. So it's not a monolith phenomena. It's a very complex phenomena geographically and also in time. And I hope there will be more specialists looking at that and trying to make a more nuanced analysis of both works and politics behind them, but also those changes, how the attitude and how the work of Malevich changed, from the Black Square until the early or mid-30s. It's a very different stories. The power politics in the art field are very similar to the power politics, geopolitically in general, where you have more symbolic power and where you have more money, these stories are being, dominant and these stories are being heard. The fact that Ukrainian artists started to travel now because of full-scale invasion, both by invitation and sometimes not by choice, but by just the situation, by the circumstances, brings more attention to Ukrainian artists, but also brings more challenge, because what happens, and not only with visual artists, we see it with cinema, we see it with literature. Recently, they become compartmentalized into, okay, you are traumatized Ukrainian artists, you tell your stories. Instead of opening a wider discussion, what the stories of the war can tell, in European context in general, what the war in Ukraine means for the overall political future of Europe, and what it means into, we talk here about, colonial, post-colonial, decolonial approaches, and as Europe is struggling with its own colonial past, I'm sorry to say 70 years after the beginning of huge decolonial movement, it's still there. What that means when it faces the neo-imperial aggression of Russia, what it means for Europe also. So all those discussions that should be happening, a little bit what Francesca Davis was trying to also mention yesterday in her keynote, it is happening a bit, but it's not happening enough. And as long as the Ukrainian story will be swept under the carpet of like, okay, guys, you have the war, you're traumatized, fine, but we have other things to do, those change will not come. And only Ukrainian, whatever cultural activists fighting for it is not enough. That should be a very joint struggle, for a bigger change, not just for Ukraine, but for the general context, because it is the only way. It's just we can do it now, or we can do it in 10 years with much more victims and much more losses and maybe certain irreparable things. On this not very positive note, I will invite my panelists, and we switch our discussion basically to Ukraine. I would suggest, if it's possible, we save the questions to a little bit later, because I think we'll have more context now with the presentations, and then out of the wider context, we can continue the discussion. I mean, sorry, thank you for understanding. Please? So as I mentioned before, now we're moving into Ukraine, basically, and going to see look at the museum's decolonization, rethinking of symbolic landscape, public spaces. And we'll have three co-panelists, two co-panelists with us here in this room, and one will be in Zoom. So we'll be talking with Dr. Alla Petrenko-Lysak, with Dr. Svitlana Shlipchenko, and with Oksana Semenik. I will introduce our speakers in the order of appearance, if you allow me, and we start with Alla Petrenko-Lysak, who has a PhD in sociology. She's an associate professor at the Faculty of Sociology at Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv. She's the author and the manager of the bachelor's degree program, Communication and Cultural Industries Management. She's also a board member of the Center for Urban Studies. Her research interests include social space, sociology, social anthropology of the city, visual studies, newest mobilities, and postmodern society, as well as post- and decolonial social change. And her current research project is focused on the phenomena of home in the times of war. And Dr. Petrenko-Lysak will talk about the general outline of the decolonization discourse and narratives in Ukraine. Please.
Yes, thank you. Greetings for all. And yesterday, previous speakers said that a joke should be told at the beginning of the speech, but I haven't any joke. But I'm worried that I won't say anything original, so I'm starting. In 2022, the war gave a powerful push to the development of decolonial agendas in Ukraine and made the reality and scale of Russia's neo-imperial ambitions apparent. The word decolonization has become widely used in both professional and public contexts, along with such concepts of as decolonization, dehumanization, desovietization. So nowadays, the term decolonization is in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war is generally used to describe Ukrainians' resistance to centuries of dependence of Russia, both an empire and as a Soviet republic. Ukrainian has adopted two important documents. In 2015, decommunization law and the decolonization law, which came into force in the summer of 2023. The latter provides for changing the names of streets, settlements, etc. In general, it aims to remove everything Russian from our country. However, decolonization is a grassroots movement, and it's impossible to fix everything in a law. Society itself has to realize why these processes are essential. We can remove all the monuments to Pushkin or other Russian writers, but people can continue to read him or these books at home. First of all, decolonization is about working with This change was accompanied by a discussion which is extremely important. Decolonization is also a discussion, and all opinions are valuable in this process. Is about cancelling, is about erasing, is about clearing, is about renewal. I put these words in quotation marks to draw attention to the fact that sometimes Ukrainians are accused of being too emotional in their rhetoric, and however, we don't deny emotions, but we want to record our reflections in such a difficult period of history, our country. And we are not waiting for the time when emotions will fade. We keep on talking. In some sense, discourse about decolonization were perceived as a way to rethink Ukrainian Soviet past. Russians' annexions of Crimea and the war helped lead to major decommunization campaigns as part of the decolonization developments. However, this approach, which includes the remaining of streets and changing the memorial plates, was not enough for reframing the complexities of the past and concluding desovietization as a critical reinterpretation of the Soviet period of Ukrainian history. The range of judgments is, you see, a cleansing, withdrawal, spurn, and for next side, justification, nostalgic identity, tolerance, both extreme manifestations of colonial trauma, hard resistance versus self-repression, which confirms the colonial impact on society. Practically, all social groups are visible if we take into account the audience to which they speak. It's politicians, government officials, popular bloggers, journalists, cultural agents, philosophers, historians, scientists, researchers, museum workers, wider audience on social media, business people. So far, the military now are not speaking. They are at the front, but then war veterans will speak. It will be a complicated and difficult conversation between civilians and veterans. What we do? We are demolition, relocation, language symbols, reinterpretation, everyday communication. It's included decolonization terms or media. Individual internal dialogue where I am. So the terms of coloniality and decolonization began to gain popularity beyond academic cycles like never before. So questions arose about the importance of critically using these methodologies rather than borrowing or copying. The current need to revise the words knowledge of Ukrainian, which was created by Eastern European studies, which were in fact a Russian view of the problem. The Ukrainian colonial discourse is a formulation of a huge number of questions within the framework of colonial studies. That is, it's a proposal to ask new questions in the context of new challenges, to both scholarships and practical actions. So some example of public discourse. This is Ukrainian decolonial glossary, is a completion of concepts from the deep, post, and colonial series featuring examples specific to the Ukrainian context. And now this glossary showcases 20 terms, each contributed by diverse Ukrainian researchers, writers, and artists. This project is willing to contribute to the dissemination and critical use of tools related to post and decolonial concepts in Ukrainian context. In summer 2024, a decolonization guide with a focus on Ukrainian was published. This is the first guide to be developed specifically for museums and the cultural heritage institutions in Ukrainian, the United Kingdom, and around the world. In 2022, there was a series of online discussions mapping Ukraine in museums. So the project focused on Ukrainians' place in the decolonization process of the museum institutions. Next example is the series of online workshops by Polish Academy of Sciences by Dr. Elizabeta Kwiczynska. This is online workshops focused on identifying and deconstruction cultural identity, hegemony, and colonial discourse, while also examining their impact on societies. Seminars hold around the topic of decolonization and museum discussions and sharing experience. Ukrainian studying their historical archives, writing professional text, and investing in professional scholars. There are already such experts, both among people from Ukraine and foreigners. Ukrainians seek to communicate with everyone the colonization principle. No one has a monopoly on the decolonization discourse. Decolonization belongs to everyone, and the colonizer and the colonized share to colonization trauma. This is a project in which the authors talk about the traumas of colonization, stereotypes and complexes that various empires imposed on their colonies, in particular about those imposed on Ukrainian by Russia. So this whole series of public discussions, there are topics decadence and decolonization, desertification, decommunization, education and decolonization, so and about youth and decolonization. And about toponymy. This series of discussion about art and decolonization, local territories, and global trends. So, interdisciplinary program of the Ukrainian pavilion at Biennale in Venice. And last, my example about the business initiative. And finally, in February 2022, Odessa Business Club launched the Odessa Decolonization Project. The main goals of the project are to study existing myths about Odessa as a Russian empiring city or Ukrainian city, and create a platform for communication to engage everyone who cares about rethinking national identity and mental decolonization, followed by a discussion. The project slogan is "Decolonization begins you." Oh, that's all. That's all. Thank you. Maybe
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was quite an extensive overview of what's happening with the decolonization discourse in Ukraine, and I want to pass the word to Dr. Svitlana Shlipchenko, who is a senior research fellow at Institute for Philosophy of National Academy of Science of Ukraine. She's also a director at the Center for Urban Studies, visiting professor for Kyiv School of Economics for the master's program in urban planning and post-war reconstruction, and at Kyiv National University of Construction and Architecture for the program of urban and regional planning. Her scholarly interests are decolonization, postcolonial studies, memorialization in urban public spaces, gender and feminist studies of architecture, and we will hear about the rethinking of symbolic landscapes and public spaces.
Yeah, thank you, Kateryna, for introducing me, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and to talk to you today. So my research interest can be broadly formulated as urban public spaces, decolonization, and changes in symbolic landscapes. And I think it's only in the open public spaces of the city that these changes and processes get their share visibility. I will describe just very brief take on 3 cases and very brief take on describing the situation, overall situation, just in a couple of words. Basically, the processes we refer to as decolonization started as early as in 1991. Then decommunization gained momentum, and then they got intensified in 2014, and then gained particular urgency with their open invasion of Russia in 2022, of course. In fact, we can speak of at least 3 corresponding waves of change in the heritage regime that had been established since 1991 after Ukraine regained independence. While the campaign of toppling Lenins was nicknamed the Leninopad or Leninfall, the current wave of decolonization has ushered Pushkinopad or Pushkinfall. Beginning in April 2022, this movement has swept through Ukraine, resulting in the dismantling of dozens of Pushkin statues, many of which lacked any significant artistic merit of quality, value, whatever. These monuments have become targets not only as signs of territorial appropriation, but also as the symbolic taking over the territory. Both the Lenin Fall and the Pushkin Fall can be viewed as campaigns of radical transformation of the symbolic landscape. Now, to steer further discussion, I'll come up, as I said, with 3 to my mind, very telling examples and very telling cases of the decolonization processes taking place in the open space, public spaces in Ukrainian cities today. First is the monument to Catherine the Great in Odessa. Very brief overview, you can see it at the picture well. It was erected in 19,000 as a monument to the founding mother and the 4 founders of Odessa, according to Russian imperial interpretation of Ukrainian history, or Russian imperial narrative. Then the monument was veiled during the Ukrainian Republic, a handy way to hide it from the public view. The practice was picked up by Bolsheviks, who then toppled it during their monumental propaganda campaign. And I'm skipping the Soviet period, which is this thing in itself and very telling as well, but for time considerations. And in 2007, the monument was put back in place. It was, in fact, it was a replica of the actual thing. Now the business started decolonization movement, but then it was a businessman who initiated and actually used his private funds for putting Kateryna on the pedestal in 2007. So this so-called restoration sparks harsh debates about the city's identity and its colonial past. So since then, the monument became a site of contention and was occasionally splattered with red paint. The decision to dismantle the statue in December 2022 followed an online poll and city council approval, reflecting the change in public sentiment towards imperial symbols in public spaces. Now it's a place of, it's a site for a makeshift memorial as part of the spontaneous commemoration campaign of those who perished in the Russian-Ukrainian war. So in this case, I refer to a way to dealing with monuments, specifically removal, as taking a monument or a piece of art or whatever away from the public view. The removal is followed by the subsequent rewriting of the city's history from a Ukrainian-centered perspective. And this process effectively addresses the consequences of epistemological violence and aligns with the learning to unlearn conceptual framework within decolonial theory. My second case deals with the Mother of the Motherland monument, or Mother of the Fatherland with all these gender permutations. This is a colossal iron figure of a woman warrior installed in 1981. And it's not only a monument, but very sophisticated engineering construction, in fact, that can be easily taken away. Besides, it meant to be a culminating point and thus a marker in the cityscape, being part of the National Museum of the History of the Great Patriotic War in 1941-45. In 2015, however, the museum changed its name to the National Museum of the History of Ukraine in World War II. Thus, the very idea of the institution and its general concept have been revised. According to the legislation, it should be subject to decommunization. However, it has survived several artistic, more or less adequate appropriations, from the Populous to the Harry Hofstaller's Christmas light show in 2023. And on August 2023, the Trident replaced the Soviet emblem, which was quite a happening in its own right, and it was worth artistic documentation. However, no competition, no public or expert discussion whatsoever was held. To me, in that case, it's important to stress that it's possible to draw attention to certain important social or societal issues through the presence of monuments in the media, through mentions in connection with specific events, actions, or when a monument is an object of a backdrop for certain events or actions, for instance, performances, artistic appropriations, recontextualizations, and so on. So the latter aspect is really often overlooked, but it is precisely here that contemporary art and criticism could attract public attention to significant topics. In this way, the monument does what public art actually is intended to do, and functions as a socially engaged critical construct or as communication platform. My third case is a bit more complicated. It has inflamed serious passions. It's about the Bulgakov's museum in Kyiv. And here two objects are in focus. The building that houses the museum and the Bulgakov monument nearby. The memorial plate was splattered with red paint several times already. And in the meantime, in 2023, the Decolonization Act, as Alla already said, was passed in the parliament, and the monument should be dismantled according to it. But there is still public outcry, and the museum is still working. What is so disturbing, at least to me, about this case, or in other words, why we don't need Bulgakov Museum in Kyiv, not only because of its overt hostile stance towards everything Ukrainian, but in Bulgakov's text, we see the image of Kyiv of the period of the Belle Epoque, in which memoryscapes crafted by imperial imagination and thus Russian culture are retransmitted. It's about a Bulgakov-centered narrative of imperial Kyiv and its undeniable role in shaping the metrics of colonial imagery. For instance, narratives of Kyiv as the mother of the Russian cities, or the birthplace of Russian Orthodoxy and its embodied versions in monuments, paintings, architectural objects, music, and so on. So, and the museum is playing out that narratives employing such instruments as nostalgia or rather an armchair nostalgia as defined by Apadurai, not a first-hand nostalgia with a flair or elements of commodification, and which has developed among reading audiences due to the popularized images of the characters in his works. To me, here we should deploy such thing as renunciation, a term from international law or refusal of cultural heritage, which is one, again, of the conceptual tools for working with cultural heritage. This means that, for instance, in the process of decolonization, society might choose to reject certain elements of cultural heritage that are directly associated with its colonial past. Renouncing heritage can also happen for ethical reasons when that heritage triggers re-traumatization or is linked to negative memories. Yes, in a way, it looks very much like repression in Freudian sense. As a private individual, you might refuse an unwanted heritage, but in the case of dealing with built environments and symbolic spaces with all the layers involved, just renouncing is not enough, definitely. The strategy of decolonization involves thinking not only not only symbolic landscapes or the inherited past, but it's also a challenging task of learning to unlearn. I'm referring to Mignola and Plastanova. A strategy and conceptual approach, again, from the toolkit of decolonial theory. And one important element is the linking or separating and disconnecting from colonial structures and epistemologies. And I will stop here and will show you the plate, memorial plate on one of the buildings in the downtown area in Kyiv, which reads, in this building, the great Ukrainian composer Lysenko lived during 1888, 1894. And in 1891, here he met, there was a meeting between Lysenko and genius Russian composer Tchaikovsky. So it's, again, it's a kind of hierarchy. Ukrainian composer never could be the genius. He could be only the great composer. And the Russian, of course, Tchaikovsky could be a genius composer. So here I stop here, and perhaps we can pass to our next speakers.
Thank you very much. So now we invite our third participant, which I hope she's still with us in Zoom. And she will bring us yet another different perspective on the issue. So I'm happy to introduce to you Oksana Semenik, who is an art historian, journalist, researcher, and the creator of the Twitter account Ukrainian Art History. She currently works as a researcher at the Ukrainian Museum in New York. She is also the author of the podcast Our Art on Radio Culture, which discusses Ukrainian art history on the national broadcast company Suspilne. She continues researching the Chernobyl catastrophe and the impact on Ukrainian art and is writing a book about the Ukrainian self-taught artist Maria Primachenko. She studied art history at Taras Shevchenko University in Kyiv and Rutgers University in New Jersey, and was a non-residential fellow of the University of Toronto in 2023. Oksana will talk about her experience working with Western museums, as far as I understand. Oksana, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me, right? Can you somehow show me?
Yes, we can hear you, and perfect. I will be the person talking, and then you can hear me. If you hear me, everything's fine. Please go.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah. So I'm going to talk today more about my personal experience, and then about this problem in Western museums, how to identify Ukrainian artists, because most of them labeled actually as Russian artists, and I think that I'm really that is kind of continuation of Kateryna Botanova lecture today. So in the summer of 2022, I launched an English language Ukrainian art history account on Twitter, which is now X, dedicated to Ukrainian art. I use it to promote awareness of Ukrainian history, Russian colonialism, and ongoing war, and the role of culture within it. So I also consistently point out that well-known artists considered Russian are actually Ukrainian. For example, if we are talking of so-called Russian avant-garde, it's Kazimir Malevich or Alexandra Ekster, Maria Sinyakova. If we were talking about 19th century, it's Arkhip Kuinji, Ilya Rypin, and some other artists that maybe not so famous. So after an internship in the Zimmerli Art Museum in the US, it's in New Jersey, which has amazing collection of 20th century Eastern European art, especially of 20th century, and they have really huge collection of Ukrainian art. I realized actually the scale of that misconception of Ukrainian art and Ukrainian artists, because in fact almost 25% of the whole collection items that were previously in it was part of Russian collection, was labeled as Russian, but they were actually artworks created by artists from not only Ukraine, but also from other countries that were colonized, like Georgia, Armenia, or they also were part of Soviet Union. So over time, I started examining American art collections such as MoMA, Metropolitan Museum of Art, Smithsonian Collections, Art Institute of Chicago, Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Jewish Museum in New York, Brooklyn Museum, and some other museums in Canada as well. Also, I know that the same problem have European museums, but so I started addressing them through correspondence, reviews on the website, social media, and it was exactly through the social media, through actually my account Ukrainian Art History, I was able to achieve changes. But the whole situation appears to be much more complicated than it looks like, and why it's actually important to, why it's not only about the labels, because people would think like, why we are talking about this when we started to talk about the colonial approach in Ukraine, for example, and it sounds more, I don't know, complicated, but in fact, it shows this incorrect attribution shows actually that there is no place for Ukrainians in art history, because that means that researchers, they are biased and false, and how we saw from Kateryna's lecture, for example, how all these exhibitions created, which narratives they have, and that means this wrong representation. So that's part of, I would say, like big iceberg. But just two cases, and maybe later you'll have more questions. So for me, the social media campaigns are not only about prompting museums to pay attention to the problem, but also making as many people as possible aware of it. And the best case scenario is for individuals to join this campaign and prove the institutions that there are many people for whom this problem is accurate, and that it's crucial point. And So for example, I would ask my subscribers to tag a particular museum, type comments, make reposts, leave website reviews, and write letters to that institution. But museums often have so-called online forums as well. So when I started such a campaign to rename Ukrainian dancers by Degas, and by the way, they previously had name of Russian dancers, which is actually also interesting that Degas didn't give the name Russian dancers to this the whole series of this artworks. So it was not the original name, and we didn't ask to change the original name of the painting. But so as also I asked them to change the national identity indications for Alla Rypin and Arkhip Kuinji, and many people joined by leaving a review on the museum website. So on my Ukrainian art history page, I constantly tell more about Ukrainian art in threads via short text messages with images, and it is essential to select the core facts, provide arguments and counter-arguments, and call to action. And it turned out later with this case that at the same time, the Odessa Fine Arts Museum director Alexandra Kovalchuk sent an official letter to the Metropolitan Museum of Art regarding Arkhip Kuinji. And in my letters to the same museum concerning Alla Rypin, I appealed to facts from his biography, artworks, and numerous research articles where Rypin was explicitly mentioned as a Ukrainian artist. And such posts may also feature successful cases of decolonization and reattribution in other institutions. However, there are also negative points. For example, pro-Russian bots or trolls often start Russian into the comments. So, and unfortunately, after Twitter's ownership change, the algorithm also underwent changes. For instance, Ukrainian accounts are shown less in the feed. And so personally, I have more than, I don't know how many thousands bots blocked. So this was the case. Yeah, but one might encounter yet another problem when institutions, they are ready to respond to the change, but to change one or two names, but not willing to change the other names that they have mislabeled in their collection. For example, this was the case with the Smithsonian American Art Museum. After my post and about artist Helen Gerardia, they connected me and changed her place of birth from Russia to Ukraine. But they stopped responding when I sent them the complete list, including more than 40 artists. And that's why I decided to show examples from this case on Smithsonian American Art Museums. So, for example, if you search their online collection, you'll see 22 results for Ukrainian artists. And we will see people who were born in 1954, or 1890, so many artists. And here you can see that sometimes they use born Kyiv, Russia, now Kyiv, Ukraine. So when we're starting talking about this problem, why they have Russia for cities like Kharkiv, Odessa, Kyiv, Kamenets-Podilsky, Vinnytsia, etc., and they have 126 results for Russia in their collection. So which means when we are talking about Ukrainian art, many people just they're not familiar with Ukrainian art history, but they're familiar with Russian one because they think that Russian art history bigger and that they have more, the Russian artists, there's so much more than Ukrainian ones. And the other problem that they have is that even when they mention Ukraine, they have this very strange examples, like they don't know where is actually Ukraine, and because, for example, with Boris Margot, they said he was born in Volochysk, Ukraine, in Russia. So it seems like Ukraine is just part of Russia. Then they have Yekaterinoslav, Ukraine, Russia, which is, by the way, also the other problem when they're using old names of the cities and not mentioning a new one. Because, for example, even I sometimes forgot if Yekaterinoslav is Kropivnitsky or Dnipro. They also use USSR, which is strange, and with Yakov Gnezdovsky, they use just born Pilecki, Ukraine in 1915, which is perfectly fine. Which is also funny because if you were born in Ukraine that was part of Austro-Hungarian Empire or some other empires, they just use it as a contemporary name of the country, like Ukraine. But if you weren't so lucky and you were born in Russian Empire, they use only Russia, not even saying that it was Russian Empire or it was Soviet Union. So, for example, which is strange, because when we started conversation with them and correspondence about this problem, they said that they want to leave, that these artists were born in Russia because it was Russian Empire back at that time. But if you will try to find some artists born in, I don't know, India, for example, or Ireland as British Empire, you will never find this. And of course, so this is kind of a problem. I know I don't have much time, but this is actually also the problem with not only identities when we are talking about, for example, nationalities, like with in case of Ilya Rypin, but also with how to refer to Ukraine that was colonized by Russia for centuries. Because, for example, sometimes some kind of in the middle of this conversation, they would say, of course, that, oh, but it was not independent country. But then again, they have, for example, other artists who were born at the same period, and they find was mentioning them as that they were born in Ukraine. So this is the huge problem. And as I said, maybe it doesn't look like I don't know, first problem that we should solve. But actually, it's very important because, for example, when you go into the museum, you can see Russian art, a lot of Russian artists, books about it, but you will never see, I don't know, Ukrainian art. And not because it's not exist, but because those artists, they listed as Russian artists. So
thank you, Oksana.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Oksana stays with us on the screen, and I invite the other two co-panelists. And we have a little bit of time for a discussion. And if you allow me, I would start with one question. Yeah, sure.
Sorry. In the meantime, I looked up for Chagall on the internet, and it popped up in German, but it was saying that he was Russian-French painter. So you can imagine the problem. And I also had my personal experience with other, but I will tell you later.
So yeah, if you allow me, I will start with a small question, and then we'll happily pass the mic to the audience. And the reason I want to ask this question is because I would want us to see that the discussions in Ukraine around the notion of decolonization, what it means, what methods, is not uniform, and it's a quite an important sphere where people also disagree. And just, I think this Monday, there was an open letter submitted to UNESCO, and it was published in Ukrainian media, I think yesterday or even this morning, where a couple dozen, or like a little bit over 100, quite well-known historians from academia, but not only from academia, from outside Ukraine and also from Ukraine, wrote for the protection of the Odessa architectural and kind of cultural space under this new decision of the city government to dismantle monuments and memory places connected to the imperial and Soviet past. And I will quote one part of this letter. Much can be said about decolonizing Ukraine, but when applied to Odessa, much of those historic center was built under Russian imperial rule, as observed by UNESCO. This program of liquidation is a very dangerously slippery slope. The rushed application of this new legislation, which leaves much scope for interpretive ambiguity, imperils swath of Odessa world heritage and its spirit of polyphonic cosmopolitanism. So I wanted to ask your opinion, what you think about this letter and the discussion it spurs, especially Svitlana probably, but also Alla and Oksana.
As it was common in Soviet times, I have not read, but I have to say, I have a say on it, right? I have not seen this letter, unfortunately. And of course, Odessa owes its planning and its big time to Russian Empire, because it's laid out during the reign of Kateryna and later on. With Kyiv is the same, because one of its big times is the Belle Epoque. So most of its architecture is due to the building boom happening at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. It doesn't mean that we have to demolish the buildings. And it's absolutely different thing because, as I said, the building is something which is meant to last kind of forever, as architects would think of it. But the buildings could be appropriated in a way that people are living in it. So people still live in the houses, in the cottages built in, I don't know, Tudorian times. So it's absolutely other thing as with monuments. Monuments are a part of the symbolic landscape. And if we are speaking about the symbolic landscape, of course we have to take radical measures.
I'm as a sociologist, so I'm talking about people. Odessa, like a city of about groups of people. So Odessa is original Ukrainian case because essentially it was it's a city of Russian Empire in Ukrainian territories. So. Century ago, it was a multicultural city, but now we haven't any culture beside Russian. So we haven't Moldavian, we haven't Jewish, we haven't Greeks. Armenian, yes. So we haven't districts on Odessa with special, unique culture, multicultural, and we have a very post-Soviet and post-Russian imperial city, and discourse in this city very conflict around places like Soviet glory, monument of wars and revolutions, which be in was which were so okay, and I was in one of the project of Rethinking memorial of glorification of the Second World War, First World War, and Revolution, Red Revolution, 1917, and the proposal from artists, it was blinging and destruction any symbols. It's empty plate with new myths about new city, Odessa like a new city. I try to answer. Sorry for my English.
You're doing very good, I think. Oksana, this is the same question to you. How far you think the rethinking, a destruction, reappropriation of the the symbolic landscape, especially when we're talking about urban spaces, how far it can go?
I've read that letter today, but in Italian. My Italian isn't perfect because I've learned Spanish, but I think it's kind of manipulation when they're talking about people, houses, and architecture. I think the main problem is monuments. For example, that monument to Pushkin. And in this article, they refer to this monument as to iconic, and also to they show Pushkin as anti-Tsarist poet, which is really strange for me because those who know Pushkin well, like poetry, and those who looking at his writings with the decolonial view, we can see how imperialist he is actually. So I don't know why this that he was maybe for decabrists and anti-Tsarists should be a point not to take away his monument, and why we should in every city have actually monument of Pushkin if there is no I don't know another country except for maybe Russia or Belarus where Pushkin is in almost every city, the monument there. And also the problem was in this Russian, with writers who lived in Odessa, and also, but they wrote in Russian language or they were in Russia. So, for example, to rename their streets and also take away the monuments, as, for example, Ivan Bunin, who just lived in Odessa for a couple of years. And in his writings, he referred to Ukrainians with slur word as khokhly. Excuse me for mentioning this, but so I think it's kind of, I think this discussion is really strange for me, actually, like why we should, why people stand for imperialist authors and why we should have their presence in our cities, even if Odessa were so-called imperial build, etc. It's also this kind of myth and propaganda that Ukrainian South was built under Kateryna II and under imperial rule, because all those cities existed before. And it's, for example, with Kherson, when we are talking about 200 and something years when Yekaterina came there, but Kherson existed even before. So it's also a long, I think, a long conversation
Oksana,
about.
Sorry, the only way I can, stop you is by interrupting. So I'm sorry for interrupting, but because you don't see me, I have to jump in. We don't have much time left. I see that Svitlana wants to have.
Pushkin monument could be removed, as I said. It doesn't mean that you should take a hammer and to destroy it, but it can be taken to some depository and kept there for I don't know, for scholars, for students, and for other people, but in other setting, in other context, which means recontextualize the monument, and that's it. So you can work in different ways with the monuments, but they provoke your emotions because they are embodying your values, embodying values of the previous regime, and that's why everywhere monuments became targets.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes for a discussion. I see the question. It's okay. I mean, I don't have to talk now. I can.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. I'll try my best. I do my best. Okay, first of all, I just want to say that what you're doing it's amazing work, and it's very important to do this political day-to-day positive work to eradicate this imperial and colonial traces in the world museums, because apparently the West is definitely when dealing quite well with own colonial heritage, is not seeing the other colonial heritages. But there are some buts always, and the one which I see in how you are describing this process is the question of nationalism. Broadly understood, because obviously we know that when the decolonial process is happening, the nationalism and the building of a nation, the recreation of the nation is very often the answer. But it's always coming with some kind of consequences, which are building some kind of antagonistic memories and some kind of antagonistic discourses, which can be problematic in the later stage. So, of course, as a political action now, it's required. But my question is when it's supposed to be discussed back, let's say. And the second question is about these eradications, because Paul Connerton came to my mind with these 7 types of forgetting, and I'm not entirely sure whether the eradicating of the past from the public space is the best way of cleaning the cultural landscape, because if something is forgotten, tabooized and marginalized completely, it can return, it can back, and can be problematic to deal with on the later stage. So what do you think about that?
But I think we don't have to approach to everything, with a universal methodology. Every case is different, I think. But the most odious cases, monuments and other things in the symbolic landscapes should be taken away from the public view. Again, I'm not proposing that they should be destroyed, but they should be taken from the public view. And as you said, as you were referring to Connerton, when you put the plate, for instance, at the monument, saying that this was a bad guy and just look at him, as they did with, I didn't show you, we can get back to it again, as they did with this memorial plate on Bulgakov's museum, that you should learn the history, not destroy the history, or not get away with, and get away with it. And Paul Constance said that it was the monument is a monument. You need this memorial pilgrimage to the monument. So once you don't see, otherwise it won't be involved in this memory work. And we have lots of monuments like that, which were markers in the symbolic landscape, to which people never came or never approached. They were just, as for it will say you nothing, but it's a short case. The guy on the horse at the equestrian statue at the Shlipchenko Boulevard. So it's, and if you were referring to Ukraine as nationalism, it doesn't mean that we are building Ukraine like single nation country. It's about multinational country, multi-ethnic culture, and of course, appreciating everybody who lived in Ukraine, every ethnic minority or every other minority who lives in Ukraine. But at first we have to understand who we are and what we are at the first stage, and then we can move to another.
Let's pass this question also to Alla and Oksana, if you want to pick up about eradication of the past and about the dangers of nationalism.
Maybe I bet it might think. For a long time, most Ukrainian culture and educational institutions have been telling a story constructed by West or Russia. This approach, of course, was reflected in the collections of Ukrainian museums, forming the so-called second-hand Orientalism. So this approach created a hybrid multi-layered combination with the Ukrainian colonial trauma. Consequently, Ukrainian culture was doubly orientated. First by the West as periphery of Russia, and second by Russia as a periphery of the West. However, Ukraine can reflect is our unique experience on the decolonization map. Now that the museums of Crimea and several others Ukrainian regions are occupied by Russia, so we must actively study the experience of countries that have successful returned alienated cultural heritage. And discussion about about the decolonization of Ukrainian museums will be more effective and productive if it's included global history of colonialism and coloniality. Maybe.
Oksana, do you want to add something to?
Yeah, just very quickly that it's actually interesting when we're speaking about reclaiming, returning our heritage and identity of these artists. People usually asking about nationalism, but they somehow never had this question about Russian art and how they, for example, never mentioned that Ivan Aivazovsky, whose name is Ovanes Aivazyan, and he's from Armenian family, and he has this Armenian heritage was really important for him. And for example, Kazimir Malevich, who was born in a Polish family in Kyiv, and he was really impressed by Ukrainian art, and they also not mentioning this. So even if you read like biographies or some catalogs, books, for example, or also about Alexandra Ekster, you will almost never heard about her years in Ukraine, which she lived here like for 35 years, I think, and she lived for 3 years in Moscow, and now she's Russian. So what I'm saying is that actually, even in my podcast, I'm trying to never forget about the heritage of artists. And for example, if they are Jewish, always mention that. Or to add Crimean Tatarian stories in Ukrainian art history, which is also very important for us and for other indigenous nations and people who live in Ukraine. But for example, with Crimean Tatarian culture and art, it's hard because after the deportation in 1944 that was Soviet made, not so many artists actually survived, and not many artworks survived in Crimea too. And now it's this occupation there. So we're not saying that we want to only say that it's all Ukrainian and forget about other heritage. We just don't want to have this Russian influence anymore.
Thank you. I think we have a little time for a last short round of questions and short round of answers. You had a question too? Okay.
Thank you for this brilliant talk. I want to stress one important note as a Berliner, as a Ukrainian from Kyiv, and Berliner long time, the question of Odessa is popping up, decolonization of Odessa. It's very interesting popping up here after the full-scale invasion regarding social media reaction of so-called Russian exile journalists. And this is for me, for example, the Kamerton, yes, what we're talking, yes, because Odessa is a super complicated case in Ukraine, still very influenced and also influenced by so-called Russia. And my remark and question would goes that what deals with Pushkin, for example, it's an absolutely incredible case how after questioning of should or we not should take the Pushkin down, because it's some kind of very also symbolic. For Ukraine, it was very important that Lenin meets the asphalt. It's very elaborative, but now it's a part of Pushkin. And immediately in reaction in Berlin, because most of them, they're staying in Berlin, it's like, it's such a wave. And for the question is, with Odessa, my question regarding that, it's such a complicated story inside how to work with Odessa in case of this decolonization, and also telling the stories of Odessa without Russia Imperial there. And in my reality, I think that for Russia, Odessa is something so important that it even elaborates and Kamerton here in Berlin very, very much. So yeah, question is what we should really do with Odessa in recent time.
I think
let's keep it.
Let's know better.
Can we keep it for a second? We collect questions and then we answer.
Thank you. I'm wondering what your opinion is on the fact that in the contemporary Ukrainian public discourse, there is a distinct lack of clear-cut definitions, clear-cut distinctions between the usage of terms such as decolonization, decommunization, de-Russification, and alike. And it seems that not only there is a lack of distinctions, but also these words are being thrown around almost interchangeably. And it's visible not only in the social media discourse and various like non-academic publications, but also in the legislative realm in Ukraine. Because, for example, like in addition to the package of decommunization laws that we've had for a couple of years now, in 2023, there emerged this new law called on the prohibition of Russian imperialist policy and on the decolonization of toponymy. And interestingly, in that law, there is no definition whatsoever of what's meant by decolonization. And this word is actually used only once throughout the whole law, and that's only in the heading, actually. And in the definition sections, there is no. And on top of that, in the definition section, like the terms such as Russian colonialist policy and Russian imperialist policies are being equated. They are being put in parentheses near each other, which indicates that our lawmakers do not think that there is a difference between colonialism and imperialism. Yeah, so what's your opinion on that? Like, how is how do you think it's possible from the side of, I don't know, like civil society sector, also academics, to potentially contribute to the to solving this problem? And that's it. Sorry.
So how can we come to terms with terms, and can we look at Odessa without imperial past? Very quick round of answers, please.
Very brief answer. We have to, so academics have to do academic jobs. Journalists have to do their part of that, and of course we should publish more translations and develop this academic discourse, academic discussion, because we are really pretty lost among those terms. But in fact, me at least, and my colleagues are using this decolonization as an amic term, that how do we see? So we don't delve into these theories, decolonial or postcolonial. That's why I'm picking out, and then to decide whether it's possible to pick up certain methodologies, certain tools to look at the things, whether it's possible, whether it's adequate, and whatever. But first, as for me, as for academic, it's important to have translations, and because otherwise, of course, people can read English or other languages, but they have to have translations because it develops a discourse and it develops a terminology, proper terminology to speak about it and to look at it.
Maybe about Pushkin in Odessa. In my opinion, the Pushkin is the part of history of Odessa, and his monuments or other things must be in the museums of Odessa. With very critically and non-emotional aspects in the describing this person in Odessa history.
Pushkin in Odessa is on the side where it could be kind of appropriated and where a plate could be put nearby. And then you can walk around and read it and know what it meant to Odessa and what it meant to Ukrainian Odessa, in fact, because we are speaking about Russian version of Odessa history, and I would prefer to speak about Ukrainian version of Odessa history.
We must construct a new history about Odessa with Pushkin and without Pushkin.
Oksana, please. Answer to the questions and concluding words.
Yeah, just very quick answer is that it's like, for example, when we're art historians talking about decolonization or dehumanization of Ukrainian art history, and some people ask, oh, then we should throw away almost 100 years of art history and never talk about it. Of course not, but we should talk about it without this colonial gaze, and to talk about all contexts that happened. And for example, also maybe we should try to focus more on those who were repressed or silenced during all this, the imperial rule or the Soviet rule, and that's how this history will be more, will be bigger, more wide, more interesting, and more full. Because I think until, I don't know, I don't want to say 2014 or 2022, but usually before we used to look with this Russian side of story, and not Ukrainian side of story, Jewish side of story, or some other many stories that we actually have and that we can talk about. And I think that's it.
Thank you. And here I think we will close this panel because the discussion around decolonization in Ukraine what it means, how it transfers to the legislation, how it works with the history. Can we erase? Can we reappropriate? It's a huge discussion, and it's happening, and I think that's the most important thing, because there are no easy answers to those very complicated questions, but as long as we work with them, as long as we look at them and discuss them, we are moving further on, and we're facing uneasy reality. Thank you very much, the panelists, Dr. Alla Petrenko-Lysak, Dr. Svitlana Shlipchenko, and Oksana Semenik. And thank you for listening so long.